My name's Laura. This is my friend Linda Yu. And Jill already said that we'd like to talk to you about a writing service called Scribe. It's really a service for people who want help to finish their writing projects. And that can be either because they're in the early stages of dementia and want help with word finding or structuring and editing their thoughts, or because they have other health conditions which make it hard for them to write or type. We'd really like to, we'd like the service to help clients continue to work and maintain their sense of independence and purpose for as long as possible. So it's aimed at people who write. In other words, the kind of people we have in mind are people like doctors, actors, script writers, lawyers, scientists, teachers, anyone who might have liked writing professionally, but also in private. So it could also be people who have other jobs, you know, and have written most of their lives in private. So it's not aimed at people who have not written before. And one of the people who's written all his life is my husband, Paul. He's someone who worked across the arts and the sciences. He was a doctor, and he was also a script writer. And my friend Linda wrote with Paul for the last year of his life. And as you can see by his death date, it's the 18th of November, so I have to apologize. I'm not on brilliant form today because it's a hard time right now. So Paul was a consultant rehab psychiatrist in southeast London at Bexley's NHS Trust. And 2 years ago, he was diagnosed with a mix of PCA and semantic dementia, but he'd had symptoms for quite a lot longer than that. He actually self-diagnosed himself before anyone else thought he was ill. And this is him over there on the right. He's really small. He was only 4'11" because he had this condition called hypochondroplasia. And that's him when he was at medical school in Cambridge in the 1970s. He joined the theatre group there, Footlights, and became very active there. He really wanted to be a writer and study English, but he lost his dad when he was 17, and his dad was a dentist, and his dad wanted his son to be a doctor. So Paul thought, I better be a doctor. So he studied medicine instead of English, but he always liked writing, and that's why he got involved in Footlights, and actually had quite a lot of success with Footlights. They had a number of successful reviews, and they became so successful that they had reviews in the West End, and he started writing for TV, film, and the radio, and he took 7 years out from medicine and worked as a scriptwriter. But when his oldest son Joe was born in 1982, he didn't have enough money to go on working as a writer, so he decided to go back to medicine and be a doctor again. And then he studied psychiatry because he always said to me he was very bad with his hands, and the only kind of medical job he could do was something where you didn't have to be good with your hands. So he was clumsy all his life. But he always continued to write. Even when he was a doctor, he worked on professional papers, newspaper articles, and teaching videos. So he always kept that going. That's him and me. And no one ever thought we were a couple because he's so small. Whenever we used to go to, passport agencies, people would make me stand back, and the children, and say, "Why are you standing together?" Anyway, Paul was working on a book about a villain who develops dementia when his own symptoms were coming on. And they developed in a very patchy way, which maybe you recognize from yourselves. Initially, I didn't really know whether this was just his normal kind of dreamy, clumsy self, or whether it was something quite different. And it felt to me like the illness was sort of knitting itself around his personality and just distorting parts of it. I kept thinking it's like walking into a fun house, something you're very familiar with, and then suddenly you walk up this thing and the path comes up and you bash your nose into a mirror and you think, how can that be? I know this person really well, and why is this part of them, why does that feel different? But I couldn't put my fingers on what it was. And with him, some of his symptoms were, you know, he never was very good at paying attention to things when he had something on his mind, but now he couldn't see things that were straight in front of him when he was cooking, for instance. Or he wasn't ever very well coordinated, but now he started sort of bashing me when he wanted to give me a hug. And the hardest thing was his planning, because he was always a very active person, and he would fill his days full of appointments, work appointments, social appointments, and they started clashing left, right, and centre. And I got totally worked up about this, trying to keep his schedule working and everything. But he didn't really notice that, and he didn't mind it either. He actually only started minding it when his word-finding symptoms developed, and when he realized he couldn't type anymore. Then he got really, really fed up, actually. And he started interrupting me at work. I work from home because I'm a radio producer, and he started knocking on my door every couple of minutes, sometimes 5 times in a morning, saying, you know, can you help me with this? I need some help writing that. And that's actually my daughter's door. But I started feeling like that. I started feeling like I want to put this sign on the door saying, keep out, because I just need 2 hours to finish whatever I was finishing. So, here we go. It's kind of around that time, when we were at that point, Paul interrupting me a lot, that he got his diagnosis. And I realized that all those feelings of sort of stress and anxiety I'd been experiencing were because we were beginning to experience our lives in different ways. We talked a lot about that, and we began to realize that our perception of what was going on between us and around us was beginning to change. And it was really that I'd been feeling the kind of cold fingers of the illness pulling us apart. And so I felt that if I was going to have to help him write, on top of keep my job going and look after the kids and do the house, I thought it's not going to be long before I break. So I thought the best thing to do is listen to what the psychologist advised us to do. Paul was lucky enough to have a really nice psychologist helping him. And she said, what you've got to do is you've got to spread the load and you've got to delegate. And I knew that it was really, he hated asking me for help. It was very humiliating. And so I thought this idea of spreading the load, actually that was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given, is to bring people in and not think that you have to be the person who has to hang on to all the threads and keep it all going. And so I thought that if we got some help with Paul got some help with the writing, then he might be able to maintain his sense of purpose for a bit longer, and I'd feel less like a carer, and our marriage might feel like a marriage for a little longer. And so we asked our friend Linda if she'd be interested in helping. Now, I knew that Linda had written and worked as a surveyor and had a lot of experience working on all sorts of written projects. So she was going to be able to do a lot more than just take dictation. She was really going to be able to work with him on his projects.
So when Laura first approached me, sorry, does that sound okay? When Laura first approached me about working with Paul, the timing was just right for me. I've got 2 children, the same as Laura, and my youngest one had just started school full-time. And I was quite involved with the school. I was running community events and fundraising events at the school. But I was feeling that it was time that I moved back to work, and I was looking for a new challenge. So Paul and I started to work together. And for the first couple of sessions, it was a little bit awkward, but we soon got over that. The more I found out about the work that Paul wanted to do, the more interested I became in helping him. We'd meet at his house, have a cup of tea, and then go to his study and spend a couple of hours at a time working on his projects. Initially, I was just typing for Paul as he dictated. But as the symptoms began to take hold, I started to have a more active role in the work. And this initial period actually helped us to get used to each other, and enabled me to become confident enough to challenge Paul in the things that he was saying. The crucial part of the success of our work together was that Paul always retained his complete clarity about what he wanted to achieve with his work. He knew what he wanted to say. Even when his capacity to articulate his thoughts diminished, he was very, very clear about what he wanted to achieve. And actually, it's interesting, I've since done some work with my grandfather, and he had a regular column in a local newspaper, which was about reminiscence, actually. And he developed vascular dementia and could no longer do his articles, and he was very sad about that. So I suggested to him that I helped him with the articles, and we actually got 5 articles published in the paper. But I became aware it was a very different process to the work that I'd done with Paul, because my granddad didn't have the same sense of ownership and drive as Paul has had with the work. In fact, he'd become too ill, and really what he wanted me to do by the time we got to the last article was actually write the whole thing for him, and that wasn't really the point of what we were trying to achieve. So over the time that I worked with Paul, we worked on a number of really different projects. The first thing that I helped him with was a lecture that he was delivering at an annual Royal College of Psychiatry conference. And then we worked on an outline for a TV documentary about his life. It had a particular slant on it because Paul's a psychiatrist, but he had in his life a number of close relatives who had severe psychiatric disorders. And the twist on the life story for him was that as a psychiatrist with his clients, he had a gap between them and him. But when it was within his own family, he had to face it all the time. And so that was the theme that ran through that piece that we worked on. We did spend some time reworking the crime novel, which he'd already been working on. And then the last thing we were working on was a chapter in a reference book on rehabilitation psychiatry. Paul had written a chapter 10 years previously, and the whole book was being rewritten. And we were working on that just actually the day before he died. The biggest and most challenging piece of work that we worked on together was a Royal College of Psychiatry faculty paper. Sorry, did you? It was actually about a piece of an area of psychiatry that Paul felt very strongly about. And this guide was about helping social workers and carers and actually ill people to try and maintain that, to try and help them to stay living in the area that they came from. Quite often people in that situation can be moved to different parts of the country because they might have a certain need that can only be met somewhere else, and then they can become stranded and forgotten about. And Paul was very, very passionate about trying to get them back to their home area. So he was particularly pleased that we managed to get this piece of work completed, and in fact it was published and came into use. Throughout the time that I worked with Paul, he regularly told me how important his work was to him and how it enabled him to have a stronger sense of purpose. The work was always very interesting, and sometimes it was sad, but the thing about Paul was he had a great sense of humour, and he often found the humour in situations, so we did laugh quite a lot at the time as well. Above all, it was a great privilege to have the opportunity to work with him. I'll hand you back to Laura.
Goes a little bit further, but because once Linda had begun to work with Paul, I realized that it was really all 3 of us that were benefiting from this process. Because Paul was managed to retain his sense of purpose and independence for longer. I had regular breaks from being responsible for what he was doing. And Linda enjoyed working with Paul, and it gave her a small income. And for me, it was really, when I watched Paul and Linda work together, it was like a piece of normality in my life. That was a normal thing for him to be doing, to be working with a colleague. And when your life begins to feel more and more abnormal, it's really nice to have this piece of normality in it. And it gave me something to hold on to. I found that really, really helpful. Now, Paul wrote until the day before he died. He decided to take his life, and that was really because his background is a very special background. He'd been a carer himself for 20 years, His wife had an early onset dementia, so he had to raise his children on his own, and he had spent 20 years visiting her and watching her decline and helping his children cope with her decline. And we have young children, and he decided that he didn't want that for our children, and also not for his children to have to repeat that experience. So it was a very unique set of circumstances that led to his decision. And he wanted to be remembered as a very active, loving dad, and that was important because our kids are only 10 and 7. And the other thing he said to me was, you know, Laura, I really don't want to go into a home because you can't have a drink there. So Linda and I got together about 3 months after Paul died to talk about how we might turn our experience into something positive by offering to help other writers in Paul's situation to hang on to their sense of purpose and independence for longer. And that's how we got, how we started developing the idea about Scribe. And that's also why we decided we wanted to model the idea quite closely on Paul, because it worked so well for him.
So we were really lucky when we started the project that we got support from an arts charity called First Framework. They're an intergenerational arts charity, and they particularly enjoy getting younger and older people to work together. They've agreed to mentor us for 1 year, and has also offered to bring some of the work into the public domain by turning it into a performance next year, hopefully. We've also set up an advisory board with members from different disciplines to give us quarterly feedback and advice. We've got someone who works in adult education, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a BBC Books drama producer. We also felt that because it's such a niche service that we're offering, it would be really good if we were able to get a patron to help raise our profile and make contact with people that might become our clients. So we thought quite carefully about somebody whose charity work would fit in with our ethos. The comedian Jo Brand is a former psychiatric nurse, and she supports dignity in dying, and she's also an ambassador for the Alzheimer's Society. And in fact, she lives quite near us in South London. So we contacted her, and she very kindly agreed to be our patron during our first year.
I guess we just stick together. Yeah. We're coming to the end. We realised that there really wasn't any point in trying to compete with the many voluntary bodies which want to encourage writing in people who don't usually write. There's an awful lot of them. So we decided it was really important to focus on people who do write and work towards offering Scribe as a paid service with very clearly defined roles, where clients can have the feeling that this time is entirely theirs to use as they please, they drive it, and they control what happens, and we, the scribes, are there to facilitate what they'd like to do.
So really the kind of projects that we think we could help with are largely modelled on the kind of work that I did with Paul. So it could be books or chapters, work-related articles, research papers, reports, creative writing, or scripts or letters to friends or family members.
We've also begun to set up a bank of scribes who have sufficient professional expertise to work with clients at a suitable level. That was important to us, because we want to match up clients with the right scribe depending on their interests and the projects. And at the moment we've got only very few, because we're just a pilot project, but we've got 3 people in Bristol and 5 in London. And some are generalists who will work on a wide range of things, but we also have some real experts, like a literary editor or someone who's got a background in helping with biographies, that kind of thing. And quite a lot of people. I've worked on a lot of script writing as well, so I've worked with actors and academics. Now, how would the service work for clients? We again thought about Paul, what worked well with Linda and Paul, and we thought the best way to start things would be to have an introductory session where we agree the objectives of what the client would like, and then we would offer 6 sessions of up to 2 hours long in which to complete the work. And at the end of those 6 sessions, we'd have a review and perhaps have a before and after questionnaire so that we can actually evaluate whether the client found it helpful. That would be very important for us to develop best practice. And if more time was needed, that could be decided at the end of the 6-week period.
So earlier this year, in July, we were actually able to present our ideas at the Innovation in Dementia Care Conference, which was held in Ipswich. And that was a really good opportunity for us to see what other kind of services we might be able to fit in with. We also started to get a little bit of attention in the press, which is really important to us because, as we've said it's quite a niche service, and it's very important for us to make contact with people that might be interested. And we were contacted by a journalist a couple of months ago who's writing a piece in a quarterly journal called The Author, which is the quarterly journal of the Society of Authors, and that's going to be published in the next month. So we're hoping that would help us as well.
Right. So if you have a relative who might fit the bill and who might want help completing a writing project that they're working on, please let them know about us. Or if you're interested in becoming a scribe yourself, if you're interested in working with someone, come and talk to us, please. We think that we can be a useful service. It's not going to be a big service, but I think that there's some people who like to continue gardening and some people who like to continue riding, and then there's just some people who like to write. And so that's the ones we'd like to help. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to say thank you to Laura and Linda for a fantastic talk. What we thought we'd do now is have a few questions, if people would like to make any comments or questions. Because we don't have a microphone to hand around, the easiest thing is if you shout as loudly as you can, and then I'll repeat the question before Laura or Linda try and answer it. So I've got one I want to ask, but does anybody have any particular questions or comments they would like to make? Please.
A few questions online.
Okay.
When it comes to charging, your website doesn't make it clear quite how you do this. Is it different levels of charging?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is about the cost of this service and how is that structured?
At the moment, we've been working with a few people and charging not very much, £12 actually. But when it works on a wider scale, we were thinking of doing a sliding scale depending on people's earnings, obviously. So it's a bit like if you want to go to private therapy, people will look at your earnings and they will decide how much, and that's really what we thought we would do.
Other questions? Yes.
I would like to learn how to do the alphabet again and numbers again.
Okay.
But I tried to write it once, the number 2, and all of a sudden I realised I couldn't do number 2. I couldn't visualise it. And I thought, if someone could help me write the numbers down, and I could copy them with even if I can't see them properly, just the outline of them, and I've done it a few times, I would be able to get back how to write the alphabet again, like
Okay.
A, B, C.
Okay.
And I can, some of the words I can visualise. Others, especially when they're like an S, it's very hard for me
Okay,
to
thank you.
visualise. And
So-
I find I can visualise number 1, obviously that's just a straight line. Number 2 is hard. Number 3 I can visualise just about. Number 4 a down.
Okay,
one.
that's fine.
And I thought if I could get some help, I asked my GP if there was anywhere I could go, maybe just once a week and help have some, and he said.
And I think, Carol, there will be lots of people sat in this room who will absolutely sympathise and empathise with what you're saying, that one of the earliest things a lot of people notice when they've got PCA is a difficulty with things like writing and reading, and not just the actual act of writing, so physically using a pen, but actually thinking up the shape of the letters and the numbers as you've described, and that's often one of the first things which stops people reading and writing. So I think there'll be a lot of nodding heads in the room for that experience. I think I'll ask Laura in a moment to make a comment about the sort of scope of the service that she has, because my impression from her talk was that it was a service for not physically getting people to write themselves again, but about being able to express what they wanted to say using someone else's fingers or typewriter. But I'll leave that to Laura to comment.
Can I just ask one more question?
In a moment,
Let
let's
me
just
answer.
Laura comment first.
Yes, in short, it is a short answer. Yes, we're not actually trained to, as an occupational therapist might be, to help with the sort of physical rewriting or tracing of letters. So I think that's something we've also talked about this, about the importance to be able to signpost people to the right service if we're asked a question like this. So we wouldn't really be able to help with this, but we would want to.
Other people might.
Yes,
yeah.
other people might.
Actually, just to say that with a client, that's one of the reasons why we want to have the initial introductory session, because we want to make sure that the person is somebody that we can really help, and that they've got that sense of clarity about what they want to achieve that I spoke about with Paul.
Carol, I'll come back to you in a moment for your other question, but there are a couple of other questions in the room I'll take first.
It's only one question.
That's right, I'll come back to you soon. Yes?
Do you use audio at all in your process? You know, the person is trying to give you very clear the words that they want to do, but you're not there. So in the gaps in between your visits, do you encourage people to use audio?
So the question is, does the person who's helping with the writing actually have to be physically in the room, or do they use audio recordings so that people can work on things in between sessions?
Well, we tried it with Paul. It was just that he couldn't get the dictaphone to work. We tried writing instructions about how to press the buttons, but he couldn't press the buttons. That's actually why Linda and Paul developed this system of the work is done when we're together, and it's not done when they're separate, because that focused Paul, and it also meant for Linda, because she had other things she was doing, that time with him was a dedicated time, and in that time they did the work, and then she would go away and come back, and again it was a dedicated time, but she didn't take work home with her. I have subsequently done one thing where I edited someone's work at home, but that's not what we would envisage on a regular basis. It's really, if someone can work the buttons, that might be something to think about. It's just that with Paul, it was a disaster, wasn't it?
It was funny actually. And that's one of the things that he did definitely found the humour in that. But I would say actually in answer to that, one of the things that was important really was the fact that we were in the room together, because with the word finding, particularly as time went on, we needed to have a conversation about what the right word was. There was the dynamic was there that Paul would kind of say roughly what he wanted to say, and then I'd say it back to him, and then it would be like, no, that's not quite right, and we just had to alter it. So we needed to be in the room together for the best effect. Although in the early stages when I was just typing, that would probably have worked okay.
Thank you. I think there was a question. Yes?
Yeah, my question is, how can you make sure that you're getting people in your services early enough?
So the question is, how can you make sure that you're getting people in your services early enough?
Well, that's why we're here, and that's actually what we're trying to work out, how to get to people at the right stage. I think that's one of the hardest things, really. We're really in the middle of trying to work that out. Trying to find the right groups, trying to, get mentioning in publications that people might read, because it's quite difficult. We've found that if you go to a too broad a meeting, then you don't find very many people who will be able to use this service. So it's a sort of difficult thing.
And in fact, if any of you've got any ideas on that, then we'd be really, really pleased to hear from you.
If I may, I'd like to ask one question myself. You said very clearly about who the service is directed at, so people who've got experience of writing before. And you mentioned that there are other organisations which perhaps aim to help people to either learn to write or to write smaller scale projects like letters and postcards and things, people who haven't been professional writers or had that sort of skill before. It just struck me that it would be interesting if you could comment a little bit about that or anything you know about those sorts of services, because quite often in this group in the past we've talked about the frustration of or the difficulty of finding enjoyable, constructive things to do to pass the day. And we know that from the experience of these groups that one of the primary characteristics of people with PCA is they've got good insight, people have good insight, they understand what's happening to them. They have something they want to communicate often, but sometimes those early word-finding difficulties can make that difficult, and certainly written communication or typing or emailing is no longer possible. And so I could imagine that there are lots of people who aren't professional writers, but who might love to perhaps feel that they have independently conveyed what they wanted to, say in a birthday card to a grandchild or in a letter explain their circumstances. We have one example of a lady who's been to this group a number of times, who with a close friend, neither of them were skilled writers, not at all, but she kept essentially almost like a diary for a year describing her situation. And not only we published some of that in the newsletter, and not only was it very, very helpful for a lot of people who could relate to what she was saying, but also I think she found it a helpful process herself, feeling that she was being able to express some of the challenges and difficulties she'd faced. So it's a long kind of comment and question, but really any advice about what people should do if they feel they're not a skilled writer, but who are excited by the idea that maybe with someone else's support or help, they might be able to communicate things which are on their minds.
I would go for my local dementia groups, because Age Concern or the Alzheimer's Society often can link you up with people. Linda and I live down in Blackheath, and there's something called Age Concern there. Age Exchange, sorry. And the Age Exchange are very active. They've just recently worked on a project where people with more advanced dementia were being helped to really sort of remember more actively, and they would write that down. So I think there's quite a number. And I mean, when you went down to Brighton, Linda went down to Brighton to talk to some hospice, and they were very interested in our work because I actually wrote Paul's letters for his family and my children for him because there wasn't anyone else to do it. And they said initially they were quite interested, and then they said, well, actually, we've got quite a lot of volunteers who come and do this. So you might find that, you know, in the local hospice or care home, there are people who will do that because they seem to exist in lots of parts across the country.
So it might be a constructive way of using the kind of the voluntary
Yes.
services which are out there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions before we break for lunch? Any more online? Sorry.
Yes, it's Age Concern help the aged. They're joined together now, aren't they?
I think so.
The question was about what's the name of the organisation? Is it Age Concern? Age UK.
Age UK.
Age UK.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Age UK.
Thank you.
I'm arranging for Margaret. We live in that area, we live in Wales. And she's going to Boyce House in Cheltenham next week to see how she gets on there. They do things like that there, we understand from the...
Well, we'll look forward to hearing your experiences of that. That's great.
As far as the other things concerned, she can't use the phones, the modern phones, because can't press the buttons and things.
Yeah.
So I bought one of the old-fashioned home phones so she could just pick it up and say hello, but she can't even do that yet.
Yeah.
But I'll teach her.
Absolutely, and we've talked in the past about phones being difficult. They're not designed for people with PCA.
Yeah,
Even the simplest designs are still very difficult. Absolutely.
Now that's why I bought this old-fashioned home.
Good effort. Good effort.
Yeah.
I think there's another question online. Yes.
I'm getting lots of useful suggestions online, too many just to read them out to you, but I'll take, I'll obviously describe them down somewhere. Can I ask you a question a little bit aside from what we've been talking about? Does your website ask for volunteers? I've got one very lady here wanting to...
The question does the website ask for volunteers? You've got a volunteer online, it sounds.
We don't ask for volunteers on the website, but we have
she
an
can
email
us,
address.
yes, yeah.
And our email address is on the website, so just email us and we will reply. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Did you want to, any other bits from the Fine. Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions, I'd